Hey everyone, welcome to Good is in the Details. This is a bonus episode. I am your host, Gwendolyn Dolske, but for this episode, I'm not the host. I'm the one being interviewed by my good friend, Professor Layne at Gonzaga University. She is the ancient Greek scholar who has been on the show twice, and her class, or her students, are going over ethics and existentialism, and she asked me if I could talk about Simone de Beauvoir. Of course, I was happy to. I mean, Beauvoir is kind of my thing. So, this is a lot of philosophy. If you're interested in existentialism, we talk about Nietzsche, there's Kierkegaard, Sartre, Camus, so much good stuff. And if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch. goodisinthe.detailspod@gmail.com. If you want to become a patron of the show for as little as $2, you can go to patreon.com/goodisinthe.details. And you can also DM me on Instagram. I want to hear from you. What are you thinking about the show? How are you doing in this time of coronavirus? We're going to do more episodes on that. My other episodes are on hold right now because I think we should address how we're all doing in this time. So hang on tight. Lots of philosophy right now for this bonus episode. I hope you enjoy. Here's the interview.
Hi, Gwen. How are you doing?
I am doing well. Thank you for inviting me to do this. I'm very excited.
Yeah, me too. And so why don't we just, throw caution to the wind and get started? So let's do some nuts and bolts questions first to kind of get that out of the way, and maybe that'll kind of help us get in to really talking about these ideas. So some students kind of just wanted another way of getting into the existentialism of Simone de Beauvoir. And so wanting to hear maybe a different way of thinking about what consciousness is, what the self is, what facticity and transcendence might be in terms explained by a different person. So could you kind of give a kind of cocktail party version of existentialism for Simone de Beauvoir?
You are definitely speaking my language. I can do that one. So the facticity, that term, it's probably highlighted in Microsoft Word, but what it means is the fact of one's existence. So the things that we cannot alter about our existence. So for example, I am 5'3". I'm a woman. I was born in a while back. and yes,
we're Zoomers, right?
And these are the facts. These are the facts of my existence, and they will not change. If I were to deny that they existed, then I would be living in bad faith or inauthentically. And that is something that she and Sartre agree on. And then there's the other side of it, where the human being is also transcendence, which means that they are more than the facts of their existence. So, for example, philosophy is a male-dominated field. If I were to say, I can't study philosophy, I am just a woman, that would be bad faith. That would be yielding to the facts of my existence as a way to not interact in this. Now, if I were to say I'm going to be in the NBA, that would also be bad faith because I would be pretending that the facts of my existence weren't there. So those are a couple of things about her notion, I guess it's not exactly her notion because she and Sartre agree on that. Where I think she really opens up is radicalizing this notion of situation and embodiment. Those two things have been taken for granted really in the history of philosophy, and the way that she delves into them are unique to the situation of woman.
Yeah, and you're thinking here of the second sex, right?
Yeah, and it comes through in her literature as well.
Yeah, but just so you guys know, and if you're ever interested in, actually you're all in quarantine now, so you might as well pick up two of my favorite novels, which I would never have read if it hadn't been for Dr. Dolske, The Mandarins and All Men Are Mortal.
Love them both.
Those texts are just fabulous. So she's a great literature writer as well as a philosopher. And so, you were speaking about the nature and the value of embodiment for Simone de Beauvoir. Would this be something that really distinguishes her version of existentialism from, say, Nietzsche's?
I think so. And you know what? I noticed that in the email when you were talking, or when you were, going over some things that we'd be discussing, that Nietzsche came up, and without doubt, she's influenced by Nietzsche. All the existentialists are. I happen to think, and I know it might sound a little bit strange, that she might have taken more of a cue from Kierkegaard. That doesn't mean that she's a secret theologian or anything like that, but just the way in which he approached existentialism through literature, and he would say subjectivity is the case in point. And I think that she may have, in her references to the seducer's diary, in reference to Fear and Trembling, I think in some ways she took more of a cue from him. Maybe it's stylistically, but also the concept of ambiguity. I think that she takes more from him. I would say that maybe Camus and Sartre took more from Nietzsche. They seem to be more of the. They seem to be more in his tradition, but.
No, that I had never actually thought about that. That there might be a split within existentialism itself. Between a Kierkegaardian approach and a Nietzschean approach. Students, for those of you who don't know who Kierkegaard is, he is a very famous philosopher who responded to Kant by saying, look, there's something beyond the ethical. The ethical is, in fact, a midway point or a stopping point, that none of us actually act on the basis of the universal, but rather authenticity is to go beyond the universal, take a leap of faith into this world of subjectivity that is verging on the absurd. I mean, that's a kind of really cheap version of it. But I think Dr. Dolske is definitely onto something here, that Simone de Beauvoir's existentialism is closer to a Kierkegaardian existentialism than maybe a Nietzschean. What other points of difference would you see between Nietzsche and Simone de Beauvoir?
I think that you can definitely see the train of thought there, and this notion of the reversal of values, essentially taking everything that we conceive to be valuable, as Nietzsche put it, and that those are the things that actually hinder our human existence. I think that where she would branch off is her notion of situation and the way in which we interact with others, that she prioritizes that. I think that she would agree with this notion of the rejection of values that Nietzsche puts forth, especially in something like the Antichrist, that when somebody is acting as though they are the most noble, that they could actually be the least virtuous. There's a line from the Antichrist that has always stuck out to me, and where he writes, there was one Christian and he died on the cross. So essentially everybody, everybody chasing after, everyone chasing after what society deems to be valuable, that can actually make you quite terrible. And in the Ethics of Ambiguity, which I believe you said that's what your students were reading, you can see her take on that almost seems kind of Nietzschean, where she is making that critique that if somebody who is holding on to these values can actually be the most tyrannical and the most dangerous, that because they are rejecting the notion that they are meaningful outside of themselves. But I think that where you have the distinction between Beauvoir and Nietzsche is her value of the interaction, that you learn who you are in situation. You figure out what you're made of. And so you might have this idea of who you are, but it's not until you're interacting with the other that you actually really start to figure that out.
Yeah, that the individual is never an individual alone. The way I always think of Nietzsche in the cheap version of it is, this is the pull yourself up by the bootstraps philosophy. Whereas Simone de Beauvoir, you can't pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Or if you did, it's always because somebody helped you, or because somebody is frustrating you that you can't do it. That we're always already in relationship with others, and the other is absolutely fundamentally part of whether or not my project of freedom is realized or if it's frustrated. Is that a fair assessment?
I think so. And I think especially with her work, just considering the time frame in which she was writing, that you have these two things that are going on, that you have the historical context of occupied France. So in that way, things are terribly disrupted. And so there would be this question of freedom and what am I made of and who am I under foreign power, under threat of death. I mean, the world is in complete upheaval. And then at the same time, she was an extraordinarily intelligent young woman who was essentially told that this is not what you're supposed to be doing. You're not supposed to be a thinker. This is not for you. So she has that kind of double whammy of the way in which she's interacting with the world, that she's trying to define herself and in a world in which she did not create. And so she's called to action, and she's meeting that call, and she gets frustrated with somebody who can't meet that call. But I think that's part of what it means to be interacting with others.
And that this is the ground of freedom, is actually striving for the freedom of others, not just your own freedom. Is
Exactly.
that right?
Exactly. And that's why I think the historical context is so important. And by the same token, here she agrees, she and Sarchka are on the same page with this. But then what she needed to do was, if this is true, if this is how you define the human being, then how do you explain the situation of woman? You know, if women are human, which I guess we are, but that's. Are
you sure?
Let's take a poll. All right, but that's the issue for her, is how could she take that notion of freedom and then explain essentially half of the population not acting free.
So when I think about the ethics of ambiguity and the importance of striving for the freedoms of others, do you think in the ethics of ambiguity she was already thinking about the situation of women?
I think it's always been there, because because I think that in her journals that there was some frustration with it, that she just, I don't, you know what, it's hard, because then talking with Peg, the Beauvoir scholar that I did the podcast episode with on what's it like to meet Beauvoir, that something that's really difficult about Beauvoir is that she never really admitted to her own knowledge, her own superior knowledge, really, that here she was extremely intelligent and fighting for the rights of women, and at the same time she would yield to the intellectual authority of somebody like Sartre. So it's kind of a bizarre situation in which she was in. But I do think that, I mean, she describes being in the library, writing all the time. This is one of the reasons why sometimes her quotes are a little bit off, is because she was always quoting from memory. You know, it's not like today where you have to look everything up and all that stuff. So I don't know. I think I'm trying to put myself in her shoes. I think she knew she was special. She was different.
Right. No, it's just one of those things that I read chapter 2, and some of the examples she gives is sometimes disparaging of women, but then I also think the second sex is like this as well, right? When you read the chapter on women in love or the narcissist,
oh yeah,
you can see how Simone de Beauvoir has either lived herself in bad faith and is trying to kind of purge herself of it via writing about it, or she herself has a touch of misogyny in her own mind's eye, regardless of the fact that she is a paradigmatic feminist figure.
Yes, I think one of the short stories that we read for a couple of my classes is The Woman Destroyed. And I warn my students that when you read Simone de Beauvoir, you know, she's a feminist, but you're not going to read this, and our concept of girl power does not exist in these texts. She is hypercritical of the way in which women participate in their own oppression. She's extremely critical of it. So no, she does not paint a beautiful picture of women at all. She is extremely critical of them. So I think today, when you think about something like a feminist literature, it's more of a girl power. It's a rally cry. And when you read, let's say, a short story like The Woman Destroyed, so I don't want to presuppose too much knowledge of your students here, but when you read it, it's an extremely tragic story of a woman who was caught up in being defined by others. And that way, her existence was completely static, and she wasn't free. And there are other female characters in there, which is nice, because Beauvoir is able to show a breadth of, a range of women's points of view, that you can't just say, here's woman, and then therefore that's how she's characterized, that women are human and they have different interests. But the main character, even the concept of being destroyed, only a thing can be destroyed, not a person. But this woman is the main character is choosing to act according to the confines of tradition, and it does destroy her. She's terrified by her own freedom. She's never experienced it.
And this is what I find lovely about Simone de Beauvoir is, I mean, the whole I guess, the foundation of the ethics of ambiguity is that we're in this constant tug of war. Like, we're both and unlike Sartre, I think that Simone de Beauvoir is much more amenable to this both and kind of existence, that we're both oppressed but also oppressing, even if it's of others, but also more importantly in the context of women, of ourselves. And so that, I just find this horrible, like, the way that women perpetuate their own oppression because they can't find any other way out, they can't find any other way of expressing their freedom without doing it through the confines of a kind of bad faith. But at the same time, it's still a project. It's still an attempt to transcend that is ultimately doomed. Is that kind of?
I think that's fair. I mean, what you have is men going out into the world, literally projecting themselves. Every single action, they are redefining themselves. And whereas woman's project is herself, that is one that will never work. She's turning herself into a doll. Painting yourself, trying to defy aging, all of that stuff. So woman is defined by her body as opposed to projecting herself outwards. And so women in other words, woman doesn't have project. She's not leaving her stamp on the world at all. She's constantly focused on her own appearance.
Exactly. So students, if you decide, just so you know, Dr. Dolske, I'm having them for Unit 3 pick their own final text. And one of the final texts that they can read is Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, the introduction. And I believe you have the possibility to read one or two chapters from later parts of The Second Sex. But in any case, what Dr. Dolske is getting at here, students, is the possibility, or what the situation of women is, and the typical bad faith, or the kinds of ways in which women participate or are kind of taught or conditioned to be in bad faith by being identified with body or identified with a kind of subjectivity that is always frustrated, a variety of different things. And so I highly suggest, if you're interested in feminism, or second wave of feminism with regards to Simone de Beauvoir, you picked to read in your Unit 3, The Second Sex. Sorry about that, Dr. Dolske, a little business there.
That's okay.
So here I want to actually segue to, since we're talking about oppression, one of the big concerns of my students was actually, how does Simone de Beauvoir justify the oppression of oppressors?
That's a good question. And I was going through the text and I was looking at it. And again, I think that we have to take into account the historical context. So she's talking about a type of revolt here. And it's interesting now reading it and thinking about, okay, she's lived through a war, through an occupied time. There's also references to Nazism, how scary that must have been. So there might be a different concept of how to handle the oppressor than what we would have today. And so I think that the way it would be justified is that if the oppressor is believing that they are free, I want to make sure I have my thoughts correct here. The oppressor wants to say, hey, if I can be free, then I'm free to be oppressive. And she is saying, no, you don't have that freedom to do that. And I think in some ways we can see that today, sometimes with the dialogue of politically correct. People say, like, I don't want to be told what I say. You mean I can't use that word anymore? And it's like, no, please go ahead. Let's know what's on your mind. But there's a part of what she's saying is that when somebody is trying to say, oh, yay, I can be free, that's what it means. That's what your philosophy is saying. Therefore, I can oppress all of these people. And she is saying the exact opposite, that that's not an exercise in freedom and oppression. And so I think that by becoming the oppressors, what it means is to restrict somebody's desire for oppressing, which is a type of restriction on somebody.
Isn't there a kind of Kantian element in this?
I think, okay, so I see Kant is such an important thinker. I mean, in terms of ethics, that it would be impossible to say that she wasn't influenced by that. Or Sartre, for that matter. When you read No Exit, there's a kind of inverted Kantian kingdom of ends and no exit. When you look at it that way, and so there's no question that there would be an influence there. It's just that it can't be a categorical imperative. So so there is this kind of casting out into the world that you can only be free when other people are free. But she, by her own stance and by Sartre's stance as well, that they can't commit it to be a categorical imperative. It's a matter of either living authentically or inauthentically.
Yeah, and I mean the difference too, right? Like, so there is a sense in which the human being, like, I strive for the freedom of others because the other, it's not necessarily because they're universally a dignified, rational agent, right? So the basis of the categorical imperative for Kant and what freedom is would be different than for Simone de Beauvoir. So that, yes, I act for the freedom of others from a Simone de Beauvoir's perspective, not because of some categorical duty, but because of a recognition of the personal, individual, ambiguous, person that exists in this tug of war, instead of the universal, dignified, rational agent. Does that seem fair too?
I think so. I mean,
it's still Kantian or neo-Kantian, but upside down.
Yeah, I mean, it's there. I mean, Kant's he's not wrong. It's a very good it's a very good way to talk about ethics. I think what is missing for the existentialists is they want to reject this idea of an absolute, that there is no such thing. And so in rejecting that, and actually that's one of the reasons why she came forward and wrote this book, was because there was this criticism of existentialism that if you get rid of the rules, then you have no moral theory. And so she needed to come back and address that there is a morality there, that in fact, and maybe this is a little bit Nietzschean, that in fact, the notion of the way people have been holding on to morality is actually immoral because it's a denial of responsibility. So, for example, removing God from the picture, that seems like it would be immoral right off the bat. Even today, people associate atheism with immorality. And what Beauvoir and company are doing is saying that it's terribly distressing to remove God from the picture, but no one is in charge. Look around. No one is in charge here, which means that we are in charge. But the more that you hold on to the idea that somebody else is in charge, the more you are letting go of responsibility for creating the world in which you are living.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you, Gwen. I have one more question, but I got to wrap this up. But one of the students, said, they were trying to wrestle with this, it's okay to oppress the oppressor. And they applied, do you use Mill's greatest happiness principle here? What kind of calculus is being done to determine whether or not somebody is worthy of being oppressed because they themselves are an oppressor? I know it's hard.
A good question.
I didn't know how to answer that. Yeah,
it's a good question. I think, and honestly, I mean, the atheistic existentialist framework for ethics is a difficult one because they throw out all the rules, because they reject all of it. And so whether or not, I always tell my students, whether or not here is what they're doing to defend that there is actually an ethics with atheistic existentialism. If you buy it or not, that's totally up to you, but this is what they are saying. And so I think that with that question, the question is still trying to find some sort of an underscoring absolute.
Oh, yeah.
Is trying to find that, and it won't work there. But I think that with Beauvoir, it couldn't be utilitarian because the calculation wouldn't work for existentialism. Iris Murdoch, the writer and philosopher, was highly critical of the existentialist tradition for this, of Sartre and Beauvoir, saying that they were unable to come up with she said that they were unable to come up with a viable ethical theory. She was more of a Kantian when you read her stuff. But I don't think that with oppressing the oppressor, I don't think that what she means is that if somebody injures you, you go ahead and injure them back. I don't think that it's a matter of violence in that way. I think it is a matter of restricting somebody's belief in what they think freedom is. If freedom means injuring other people, then you have to restrict them. Right. Then you have to stop that. And that might be done with a physical restraint or something that, that is quite tough. And again, I would just remind the students that she's in World War II, surrounded by Nazis, that's what's at stake there. So I think that her concept of stopping the oppressor is a big one. I mean, even in the Ethics of Ambiguity, when she traveled to the States and she could see what was going on in the South, she also was, very mindful of that, of the oppressors using the idea of nature in order to justify an oppression. And she rejected the concept of nature. So I would imagine, and she could see that there was that violence going on there in the States as well. So in order to halt that, there might need to be more than a finger wag, I guess.
Like, if you had one thing that you wanted a group of 35 kids who were all evacuated from Florence in a moment's notice to know about Simone de Beauvoir, what would it be?
I think that Simone de Beauvoir, I would get to know her memoirs in addition to her literature and her philosophy, and that keep in mind in reading all three of those parts that she is a living philosopher. She's not somebody who just went away into a study and just wrote some texts, that she was a living, breathing, constantly evolving and thinking philosopher and interacting with people. And that's something that makes her very, very special.
Didn't she love to hike?
Yeah. Yeah.
I love thinking about that. That's so awesome. Okay, well, Dr. Dolske, thank you so much for taking your time today. Students, give her a round of applause. Yeah, that was so awesome. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. This is exciting. During quarantine, I get to talk about Beauvoir. I appreciate that. Really, you've done me the favor.
No, you know. All right, thank you so much. Bye, guys. Start on your Socratic Dialogue blogs, and hopefully you guys will do a Marco Polo, and I'll see you there. If not, I look forward to reading your final papers in Unit 3. All right, good night. Bye.
Bye.